You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Today's podcast is brought to you by OSV Kids, a magazine designed to help children grow in their faith throughout the liturgical year. To find out more, head to osvkids.com. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Monday, April 11th, 2022. Today is also Monday of Holy Week, and today is also the feast day of Saint Gemma, a young woman who became a saint in Italy. Now, all week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we are going to be meditating on the very last day of Jesus Christ's earthly life. Now, just to be clear, we're going to be using the Jewish understanding of when a day started and when a day ended. Now, if you were a Jew, you would know and believe that a day ended at sunset and the next day began. They weren't like us where everything revolved around midnight. So when the sun was going down, you would know that one day was ending and another was beginning. So with this understanding, we can see that the Last Supper and the events in the agony that happened in the agony of the garden, through the trial, the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ, all occurred during his last day of his earthly life. Of course, he would die and be risen from the dead, but he would be in a different glorified form then. So today we are going to talk about what happened right after sunset, which is the Last Supper. And all week we're going to talk about what happened, and we're going to talk about why this is so important and what it means for us today. So the first thing that happened at the Last Supper was the first Mass. Christ gathered his closest followers around him. They went up to an upper room and they celebrated the Passover meal, which is something handed down to them from Moses, that they celebrate God saving the Israelite nation from slavery in Egypt. But Christ did it a little bit differently. He broke bread and he made it clear to them that this was a memorial and that this bread was no longer bread. It was now his body, and the wine was his blood. Now, what can be confusing sometimes is that not all of the Gospels include the words of this first Mass. And do you know why this is? It's because the Gospels weren't the first thing written about Christ and this first Mass. In fact, St. Paul wrote his letters to the early churches many years before the Gospels were written. And St. Paul wrote down the words that Christ said at the Last Supper at this first Mass. And he wrote them down as instructions for all of those that had been ordained priests in the early church, that were saying the Mass from those very first years, just as Christ asked. So I'm going to read you a part from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. This is found in chapter 11, where Paul wrote down these words, and he was the very first one to do so. So Paul says, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also the chalice after supper, saying, 'This chalice is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this chalice, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" So those are the very first words said by Christ, practiced in the early church, because as soon as the church was established, they were saying Holy Mass. They were consuming Jesus Christ fully present in the Eucharist. That happened right away. So now, why is this so important? Well, in order to know what this means, you need to understand the word memorial. Christ asked, do this as a memorial. Now, we might think that that just means to remember, but it means so much more than that. A memorial means that we are making something present again, that it is indeed happening again, that Christ dying on the cross, that Christ making bread and wine, his blood and body, that didn't just happen once. It happens every time a priest says Mass. It is a memorial that we participate in, that is made present for us again. So when you go to Mass, don't just zone out during that part. You are standing at the foot of the cross. You are present at the Last Supper as Christ broke bread and changed it into his true present, his body. You are there. It is present again. Now, the other super memorable thing that happens at the Last Supper, of course, Christ teaches his disciples. Many wonderful things happen. But if you go to Holy Thursday service, you know that we wash feet at this service. And it is done once again as a memorial for what Christ showed us at the Last Supper. Now, if you don't know, washing feet during the time of Jesus was disgusting. It was the lowest, most miserable job reserved for the lowest, most miserable slave in a household. People's feet were filthy. There was animal waste and human waste and all sorts of disgusting things in the streets. So people's feet were gross. This is why Peter throws a fit when Jesus tries to wash his feet. This is not what the Lord of the universe should be doing, he says. But Jesus says, I have come to lead you and love you, and that means that I serve you. Jesus has set this amazing example that if we are to lead people, if we are to love people, it requires sacrifice, it requires service. And it requires that we place ourselves at the lowest point, that we don't stand above everyone and demand honor and prestige, but that we get down on our hands and knees and we serve those that we love, that we take on humiliation and even gross tasks out of love. And so, Sprouts, all week, my challenge for you will be the same. We are going to learn and practice the phrase that we repeat over and over again in the Divine Mercy Chaplet. And that phrase is this: for the sake of his sorrowful passion, have mercy on us and on the whole world. My challenge for you today is to say that with whomever you're with 3 times. Practice that, think about it, and really submit yourself to the mercy of God, which really the gates of mercy were open wide when Jesus died on the cross.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God created you to be.
This show is a production of the Spoke Street Media Podcast Network. For more great podcasts, visit spokestreet.com.